Welcome back to Mr. Drew Paints with you. Today I will be showing you my process for doing a still life in acrylic paint. Here's my palette. It's a lot more colors than I usually use, but they were just really convenient to have on hand, especially since acrylic dries so quickly. Something to keep in mind when choosing acrylic paint, it's kind of transparent already, so I try to choose the more opaque colors unless you want transparency for glazing and things like that. So look on the back and you can see those little boxes that I'm pointing to. So check for your paints if they're transparent, semi-transparent, or opaque, and that will give you a better idea on how they're going to behave once you start painting with them. I'm doing the painting here on illustration board, and I kind of go back and forth between using either illustration board or acrylic primed canvas. I feel like the canvas is a little less absorbent than the paper, and so it seems to me like I have a little extra time to do blending, but not much, so it's really not a huge difference. There is something nice about the illustration board, how it grabs the paint, but either surface that you use, I find that I have to do some layering. So you can see there I made a really dark mix with some ultramarine blue, some burnt sienna, a little bit of magenta, and it's just transparent. I made it as dark as I could. I did not put too much water in it, and especially those dark colors, they seem to have more transparency, so I just overcome that by doing multiple layers. Some artists prefer the quicker drying time of acrylics to oils, but I find that you just have to do a little more layering with acrylic than you do with oil. So this first pass, I'm just blocking in the local colors of each of these objects. There's a strawberry, a lime, habanero pepper, and I think a couple little pansy flowers there. If you are working on illustration board, and if you tape it down like I did here, be really careful as you lift off that tape. I've torn the face of the illustration board a number of times as I tried to lift up the tape. Even on this one at the end, I took a razor and I scored the edge between the tape and the painting, and it's still, even being very careful, it lifted up a little bit of that paper. Another trick you can use if you need to tape down your illustration board or you're trying to tape off a border is just take your tape and touch it to your clothes real quick, your shirt or your pants or whatever you're wearing, and it'll get a little bit of lint on there, and that's going to keep it from grabbing the illustration board too permanently. It is really nice with acrylic to just have that soap and water cleanup. That's very convenient. I like that aspect of acrylic. I will say I am more of an oil painter. I'm a little more comfortable with oil paint than acrylic, but there are definitely some benefits, and sometimes even depending on the subject you want to paint, you might want to use acrylic over oil. Here, as I get into the strawberry, a little later on when I start putting the details on, I was actually really thankful for how quickly the acrylic dried, and that allowed me to go back with those fine details, where with oil I might have had a harder time controlling that. I might have ended up just lifting up paint or blending it too much. And speaking of lifting up paint, here, so I put all these washes down, and you can see they're pretty transparent. But before you put a second coat or a third coat, make sure that previous coat is dry. If I try to put a wet coat on immediately after I put one coat down, I usually end up lifting up some of that first coat. So here, this is my second coat on the background. You see it's already starting to get a little bit darker. I think I'd do another one or two coats on the background to get it to the final value. A friend of mine just recommended a book on still life painting, so I ordered it on Amazon, got that about a week ago, and there were a lot of examples of still lifes with limes in them, and there was something that drew me to that, so I wanted to do a painting with a lime in it. And this is a copyright-free image I found off Google Images, so it's not my photo, but it is labeled for reuse. So one of the biggest challenges with acrylic, I do think the transparency for me is kind of a challenge, but then also blending, trying to get that soft transition that we're used to getting with oil paint. I think even with watercolor it's a little bit easier to get soft edges, but here we have to do some kind of unique tricks and techniques to give the impression of soft edges. It's not like oil where you can just put one color next to another and then blend them together. You can, if you do that really quickly, if you pre-mix your colors, put them down and blend them immediately, you can do that a little bit. But I, more often than not, am finding I have to use some other techniques, and I'm going to slow the video down here in a minute to show you some things I use to blend. So here I have a brush, and I'm doing kind of a dry brush, a little bit of a scumbly approach to how I'm putting the paint on. And then you see me tap the paint with my finger. That also helps blend the edge. And then rather than just trying to blend between the light and the dark, I have that transitional mid-tone. So that, in my mind, is very important with all paint, and especially acrylic paint, to give that impression of a soft edge, have multiple color transitions as you work from light to dark. As I apply the paint, I think, what type of edge do I want to have? So there on the shadow on the lime, the shadow on the pepper, and the shadow on the strawberry, they all have a softer edge. So as I put the paint down, I try to scrub it on and tap it with my finger and blend it out so it already has that soft effect. If I put it down and I have a really sharp edge and it dries like that, it's going to be very difficult to try to get a soft edge over that area. I'll show you another little technique that I use here on the pepper as I work on putting in the lighter areas. I haven't slowed this, I haven't sped this video up as much as I usually do. There are definitely some things that you can't pick up when you're watching a high-speed video. So for that reason, I have a couple of these spots where I slow it down to real time, or maybe slow it down a little bit more. If you want to watch this faster on YouTube on a computer app, I think there is an option in the window to speed it up, so you can kind of speed it up as much as you want there. So here's another blending technique. You see I put the paint down, and then this is just a clean brush with a little bit of water on it. You don't want it dripping. And then I take that second clean brush and I blend out immediately. So I put the paint down with the one brush, then take your clean brush and just soften it right away. That's a great way to keep that softness from the beginning and not have to worry about fighting those sharp edges. When I put the highlights on, and this is true for oil paint or acrylic or gouache, and even watercolor, when you're doing highlights, they usually have some color in them. It's not just white paint, even though this looks like very bright paint on the habanero, and when I get to the strawberry highlights, it'll look like very bright paint, but I make sure to put a little bit of color in there, and it usually has some of the color of the light source. And maybe some color of the object itself here. So the highlights on the pepper, I put a little bit of yellow and orange in there. And then the highlights on the strawberry, I put a little bit of red in there. You'll see if you ever put just a pure white highlight on something, it jumps out so much. It doesn't look natural. So make sure to keep those highlights a little bit darker than you think you're going to need them. And then also add some color to them. Don't just use plain white. And speaking of darkness and lightness, one thing I forgot to mention is that the acrylic paint, it tends to dry a little bit darker. Oil paint dries a little bit lighter, watercolor dries a little bit lighter, acrylic and gouache both dry a little bit darker. So sometimes you have to account for that, especially if you're remixing a color to try to match something you already have down. I'm using a Masterson Stay Wet palette. That's the palette in the beginning that I had all my colors on, and it's a great system. I would look that up if you're interested in doing acrylic painting. A friend of mine, Jed Dorsey out in Washington, he uses that. He's a lot more accomplished with acrylic than I am. He uses it very well. But that palette, what it does is it allows you to keep your mixtures wet for a very long time, rather than just using a regular paper palette or even a glass palette and having the paint dry really quickly. So in my mind, that helps kind of cut down some of the frustration of dealing with the quick drying paint. So this is, I think, my third coat on that background, and it's just about as dark as I want it to be. I might put one extra coat on there just to make sure I cover it up. So I like the opacity of paint when I can get it, but there definitely is an advantage to having transparency. I've seen artists like Robert Bateman use acrylic when it's mixed with water or a medium and it's very thin. You can glaze it on top of your painting and adjust and alter colors with it like that. Okay, now we're getting into some of the details on the strawberry. Anytime you're doing something like this where there's a lot of little details on the surface of an object, whether it's seeds on a strawberry or maybe you're doing a vase with a lot of decoration on it, do the base form first. So you can see I painted the basic colors and values of the strawberry, the light side, mid-tone, shadow, and I got the edge soft so it looks like the appropriate type of round shape, and then you can go back in and put the details on. So don't start with the details, start with those big forms and then go back and carefully put the details in. As I mentioned, I do have a little bit of red in this highlight. I think if I had put just a pure white, you would see it just looks way too stark. And here I'm using that second brush technique, a little bit of a clean, damp brush, just to soften some of those highlights out. And that's important with highlights as well. Sometimes they are pretty crisp, like very clean edge lines, but most of the time they have varying shape and then also a little bit of softness on one of their edges. You can see here right now on that very top one, there's a little bit of a softening as that edge goes into the darker red of the strawberry. This is kind of fun to watch. I slowed it down a little bit. It's still not actual speed, but this is fun to see because just even some of these basic shapes of the highlights already start to give you an idea of the texture of the strawberry. I tried to copy the pattern of the highlight as accurately as I could, but to be honest, you don't have to be, super exact. Unless you're going for a photorealistic effect, then I would try to be a little more careful. But look for patterns. It's really amazing. Even on the seeds of a strawberry, you can see kind of this diagonal pattern where the seeds are growing. And that can help you plan it out. And planning really helps. So break things down, maybe the biggest shape first, and then break it down a little bit, then break it down a little bit more. If I was to start with one of these little speck highlights I'm putting in now, and then keep going from there, I'd probably run out of space by the time I got to those larger highlights. So a little bit of planning, look for those patterns, then think of the direction of the light. Here the light is coming from the left hand side, which means if there's a divot, then the right side of that divot is going to get a little bit of a highlight and the left side will be more in shadow. So think through how the light is hitting your object and what side of that object will be getting more light, what side will be in more shadow. Now I'm putting in some of the actual seeds, which are not very dark. Just like with the highlights, I put some red in them. The seeds here I'm not using just a pitch black. You look for the actual color and value of them. If I did use a pitch black color for those seeds, they would just jump out way too much. So here I mixed up kind of a dark earthy red, darker than what the face of the strawberry is. And there's having some of that red in those seeds also kind of helps them be more harmonious with the strawberry. And then I mixed up a little bit of a darker color to put the seeds in the shadow, because the value is going to shift from the light side to the shadow. Even if you have something that is the same value, when it's in the shadow it'll be darker than when it's in the light. That sounds obvious, but it's helpful to think through just the values from light to shadow. Now I'm going in and putting the light side on the seed. So even the seed has a light side and a shadow side. And attention to details like that can help make something more convincing. And it kind of depends on the style. Once again, if you're going for more of an impressionistic style, I probably would not worry about putting all these seeds in. But if you're going for more of a photorealistic style, then I would take the time to put in the seeds, even the light side, shadow side of the seeds. Here the strawberry was large enough that it kind of justified putting that detail in. If it was a very, very small strawberry, maybe if the strawberry was the size of one of those flowers, it probably would be too small to really bother getting in all those details. I might just put a little bit of the highlight in. Here I'm trying to darken that cast shadow underneath some of these objects, but I'm not able to get it really any darker, so I'm going to go back and lighten up the foreground, and that will make the shadow underneath the object stand out a little bit better. When I do acrylic paintings, I jump around a lot, and you can see that here on this video, where I'll work on an area for a bit and then let that dry, and then jump over, work on another area. Right now I'm just kind of refining that pepper, adjusting some colors and values. And I haven't tried egg tempera yet, but I almost feel like you could use acrylic in a very similar way. I have seen some videos of people using egg tempera. I believe they use more of like a very fine, small, round brush and do a lot of hatching as they put that paint in. So that technique could also work with acrylic. At this point I basically just got to finish up this yellow flower, and then a couple little touch-ups, and then, as I mentioned, go into that foreground to lighten it so that that cast shadow shows up. That's something to keep in mind with either drawing or painting. Regardless of your medium, we are limited in the amount of values we can put into our art. So, like I was saying, I can't really get any darker for that cast shadow. So if I want that to stand out, then I have to lighten what's around it. And that works with pretty much every aspect of painting. If I have a color that I can't get any stronger, then I just go the opposite way and neutralize or weaken the colors around it, and that will make it stand out and look stronger. Soft edges and hard edges if you want. Although that I don't think there's really that much adjusting you have to do, but having softer edges and then sharper edges, just carefully placing them to be the most effective. If you have a sharp edge around everything, then everything jumps out. And I say that kind of hypocritically because here I have a lot of sharp edges around the objects, but areas like the shadow side of the line that, you know, it kind of blends in with that darker background, so that helps give a little bit of softness to it. Use that lighter color just to let that dark shadow show up underneath the objects. Painting either black or white is a challenge, but it's very fun. It's interesting to try to find the right color for making a black color look like it's light or warm or cool, and same thing with white. I think white has a little more color bouncing around in it, but both of them present a challenge. I like looking at the black suits that John Singer Sargent put on a lot of his subjects that he painted portraits of. Take a look at those and see how he controlled the values and what colors he used. So just a few touch-ups here, a little bit of softening, and we're done. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, or if you have any ideas or things that you like to do with acrylic paint. I'd love to hear it. So hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.